Lord, and their leadership is corrupt, and they are not honoring the Sabbath years and giving the land rest. And so there was predicted by the prophet Isaiah that there was going to be an exile. Now, I've got to pause there for a minute because, sometimes people don't understand what exile means. They think maybe it just means we're going to kick you out, But exile really is picking you up and bringing you physically to where you are at spiritually, which is far away from the presence of the Lord. And that's what's going to happen in the exile here. And, there's another repeating theme here, and that is that oftentimes God uses Israel's enemies to do the disciplining. And that was the case with the Assyrians, the Egyptians before that, and now the Babylonians. And later we're going to see the Persians, and then Greece and Rome. And you could probably go all the way into today. But it's going to be the Babylonians that are going to come down, and they are going to destroy Jerusalem. And that's going to take place in 586, 587 BC. But when we talk about the Babylonian exile, we're dealing with the south, Judah, with the headquarters being Jerusalem, right? And the temple was built in Jerusalem. So there's a lot at stake here. In what we see, and this is important to remember as you are reading 2 Kings 17 through 25, is that the Babylonian exile happens in 3 phases. And the first phase is going to take place, and that is going to be in 605 BC. And the first person in that group, one of the first persons, is a young man by the name of Daniel. And he's going to be taken into Babylonian exile. Now, when the Assyrians came into the north, they just obliterated the place. But the Babylonians came into the south, and they took away all of the talented people, all the gifted people, the rich people, and they left everything else behind. And so in the first wave was Daniel in 605, and we can get into that a little bit. Daniel, of course, writes from the place of exile, and that's important when people are listening to Daniel to know this is a young guy that really wants to serve the Lord. He's going to be tempted to become like the Babylonians, but he's not going to do it. He's actually going to become one of the real all-stars in salvation history. And then in the second wave of captivity in 597 BC, and remember, our numbers are getting smaller because we're headed towards 0, that is going to be Ezekiel. And we have Baruch, who is working with Ezekiel. And then finally, there's going to be a third wave into exile in 587 BC, and that is when the temple is going to be destroyed. This beautiful, amazing temple that Solomon built is going to be reduced to nothing. Now, this is really, really sad in Israel's history. It's like their faith has completely devolved. It has been ruined, and they're going to have to reconstitute in Babylon, and they're going to be there for 70 years in Babylonian captivity. And so when you're reading during this period, be aware of Daniel, of course, and we have a lot of other books that take place. We have Daniel, we have Ezekiel, Obadiah, Habakkuk, Judith, Zephaniah, Nahum, Jeremiah, Joel. We have all kinds of books that should be read in this particular context.
Yeah, and as you noted, the exile, I really appreciate this because if there's anything I'm taking away from this conversation, it's that understanding of exile, which is God's bringing them to a physical place that is representative of their spiritual reality already. And as you described, that third wave of exile is when the destruction of the temple happens. And we recognize that this is what they've done. I mean, because in so many ways, being so unfaithful to temple worship, so unfaithful to the Lord and his commandments, and have just turned to their own Asherim and their own, high places and other places they wanted to worship. And that makes sense then. Here's the Lord's temple where they were meant to be given their identity in that renewing the covenant on a daily basis in this incredible way. But they weren't living a covenant. And so here's this place that is reduced. I mean, I think is it Jeremiah I think it's Jeremiah who he's preaching to the people and he's telling them You can't just keep saying, this is the temple of the Lord. We have the temple of the Lord. We have the temple of the Lord. We have the temple of the Lord. Because, yeah, you have the Lord's temple in your presence, but you're not living like you do. And so there's that sense that God even is saying, almost in a certain sense, I must bring you into exile. Like he says through Hosea, I must bring you into exile, into the wilderness, so that I can bring you back to me. And so this is all remedial. I think that in so many ways it's meant not to be simply punishment because you've done wrong in the sense of my vengeance, my wrath, my justice, but it's meant to be justice, of course, and it is the wrath of the Lord, but it's oriented towards healing. It's oriented towards restoration and to be the remedy, basically, of healing God's people's unfaithfulness.
Right. And there is a theme, a recurring theme, all the way from the beginning of the Bible with the Garden of Eden, all the way to Jesus, which is the theme of exile and return.
Right.
Exile and return. Exile and return. And maybe another way that people can understand exile as, God picking you up physically and bringing you to where you are at spiritually is the common modern notion of excommunication. People talk about excommunication and they say, whoa, he kicked him out of the church. No, he didn't. No, that bishop did not. What did the bishop do? He drew a line in the sand and showed you, you are out. You aren't in because of whatever it might be, but it's not that, well, we just sort of don't like you and we're going to kick you out. It's a gift of grace and mercy that God is showing you where you're at and hoping that you will tend to that hunger in your heart to return to the Lord. That's the goal of this, is restoration, which is what we're going to see in the next period when we get together is the return. But here's one of the sad points about exile. In exile, a number of changes took place. One is they didn't have the temple anymore. So they started to really gather around the family kitchen table, and that became the place of sacrifice. And this is where the rules of kashrut, really begin to develop about this almost a liturgy around the table and what's clean and unclean. But here's another thing that started to develop in the exile, and that was the Pharisees. The Pharisees became really the teachers and the leaders. They taught the people. But the saddest part about the exile is that while they were far away from the temple, and the writer of Lamentations is lamenting that they're not around the temple anymore, lamenting that they're not in Jerusalem anymore. But here's the sad thing. Some of the people in exile kind of liked it.
Right.
And that's the danger, is that if you find yourself in exile in your life, in sudden